Jury in the courtroom.
Everybody be seated. If you would face the clerk and be sworn, please, sir.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Have a seat. Slide up the microphone, please, sir. You may proceed, Mr. Fuchs.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jurors?
My name is Michael Devaney. I was formerly with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for a little over 37 years.
And you say formally.
Yes, I'm now retired.
Okay. As with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, what duties did you have?
For the last about 20 years before I retired, I was on a violent crime squad. My main responsibilities were working child abuse cases and violent crime.
Are you a sworn law, or were you a sworn law enforcement officer?
Yes, sir, I was.
Okay, so you were an investigator.
Yes, sir, I was.
In working those kind of cases, I'm assuming you're talking about conducting investigation, reviewing police reports, things along those lines.
Yes, sir.
Interviewing witnesses.
Yes, sir.
In that capacity, did you have occasion to become involved in the Mike Williams disappearance?
Yes, sir, I did.
How is it that you became involved initially?
Basically, back in 2010, there had been an agent that had been working this case, he and other agents. He was promoted. I was assigned this case from that point on. And again, we started an immense review of all the information that had been gathered at that time.
When you say an immense review, what do you mean?
Basically, my main task is to take information that had been gathered since year 2000 by FWC, Florida Wildlife Commission, other law enforcement agencies, state attorneys, investigators, at least 3 other special agents with FDLE, conduct a review of all of those cases and just basically try to get a handle on it.
Now, you're talking about 2010, roughly 10 years after the disappearance of Mike Williams.
Yes, sir.
And you're going back and reviewing it.
Yes, sir.
Would it be fair to say that you're reviewing it because it hadn't been solved?
Correct.
Cold case, if you will.
It was.
And essentially your review would be a new set of eyes on it for an evaluation, correct?
Yes, sir. Coming into it, I knew very little about the case. It was a new set of eyes.
Okay. And what was the purpose for you to come in and do it at that particular time? Had anything developed, or it was just take another crack at it?
What we wanted to do is, again, review everything there was about this case to see was there anything that was missed, talk to the other investigators who had been involved in this, and try to develop maybe leads or new information. Of course, we had a real situation in that when this case was first investigated, it was not investigated as any type of a crime. It was a missing persons report. So we had to examine that, and we realized that a lot of information that we maybe could have had at that time, it was lost.
When you say it's lost, what do you mean?
Well, basically, this whole situation back in December of 2000, it was handled by various agencies as a missing persons report from Lake Seminole. There were items that were left at the scene, items gathered, but they weren't treated as evidence per se as you would in a normal criminal investigation. So when we had to look at this, again in 2010, those items were gone. We had photographs of that information, but as far as the ability to do any sort of an analysis, again, that was gone.
And just for clarification, let's say I know a boat was recovered in this particular case.
Yes, sir.
Under normal circumstances with a homicide investigation, you would take steps in order to do a forensic examination of a boat, would you not?
Absolutely. A boat would have been seized, would have been examined at the scene, and eventually would go back to a forensic laboratory such as the one in FDLE. And there would have been an analysis of that boat and everything inside the boat.
But that was not done in this situation because it was a missing persons, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Same thing with the waders that were recovered and other items such as that, correct?
Absolutely.
Would it be fair to say that handcuffed the investigation in a lot of ways?
It did. because we didn't have those items to examine. The only thing we had is basically interviews conducted at the time by the people there on the scene in the year 2000.
Now, it had been originally classified as a missing person.
Correct.
You're now taking a new set of eyes at it. Had the title of it, if you will, changed? Was it still missing persons? Was it, had it been declared a homicide? What was the status of the investigation?
Basically, it had changed in 2004. Now it was a suspicious missing person.
What does that mean?
Basically, we could not prove or had no information it was a homicide, but taking the information in its total, just a lot of things didn't quite make sense. There's a lot of things that we needed to rule out that we really could not rule out as far as this being any sort of a accidental death. There were too many things that were unanswered.
In 2010, were there particular persons that were being looked at as possible suspects?
In 2010, going back a little bit, once I, again, was assigned the case, I had a lot of stuff to review, a lot of people to talk to. And what we decided to do in December of that same year was to bring most of those investigators together, along with an investigator from Tallahassee PD and Leon County SO, and sit down and talk about this case, put everything on the table per se. I conducted a PowerPoint investigation, again, went over every aspect of the information that we knew. And at the end of that, we came up with some ideas, and with that, we did develop persons of interest.
And who would those persons of interest be?
It would have been Denise Winchester and Brian Winchester.
And at that time, Denise and Brian had been married, correct?
Correct. They were married in 2005.
And what is it that made them possible suspects or suspicious?
Well, you have to go back. There were several things. The investigators that were assigned to this case, including myself, we were very uneasy about the insurance situation. We realized it was Brian that reached out to try to find out what it would take to get Mike declared dead. It was Brian that did that. We found out that Brian actually sold a $1 million insurance policy to Mike just before his death. That needed to be researched. We had problems with...
Let me stop
I'm
you
sorry.
right there. Talking about the insurance policy, was Brian a benefactor of the insurance policy?
I believe he was.
Did the payout go to him or did it go to Denise?
Denise.
Okay. So the payout of the insurance policy would be to Denise.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So at this point, at 2010, upon the review and everything like that, no arrests were made at that particular time, correct?
No, sir.
Would it be fair to say that basically the case, despite the review, was still in the cold case status and unsolved?
It was a cold case, but it was certainly not ignored. We were hoping to have developments. I mean, we certainly examined, the behaviors of both Denise and Brian between that time and, later on. Again, they were sort of under a microscope by our agency.
Okay. Did things change in August of 2016?
They did.
What happened?
Brian was arrested for the alleged kidnapping of Denise.
Were you informed of that investigation?
I was. One of our supervisory special agents was contacted by David McCraney with the Tallahassee Police Department that there had been a situation where Denise had been kidnapped and that she was en route to the Leon County Sheriff's Office to meet with an investigator about the incident that occurred earlier that day.
I'm going to stop you right there. David McCraney is, you said he's with Tallahassee Police Department?
Yes, sir.
Does he have any other significance as it relates to this case?
He is Denise's brother-in-law. He is married to one of Denise's sisters.
Okay. So Florida Department of Law Enforcement is contacted about the situation that she was en route to the Leon County Sheriff's Department.
Yes, sir. And then I was contacted by the supervisory special agent, and once we found out that she was en route to the Sheriff's Office, I obtained the assistance from another agent, Will Michler. Contact was made with investigation of the Leon County SO. We found out that Denise was currently being interviewed by one of their investigators, and we went straight to the Leon County Sheriff's Office, to the investigations unit, to basically monitor what was going on.
When you say monitor what was going on, what does that mean?
Well, she was being interviewed in a specialized interview room at Leon County SO. When I mean specialized, it was basically, there was a videotape where you could sit in another room and you could hear and listen to that interview.
Okay. And were you listening in then at that point?
Yes, I was partially listening and also getting information from the investigators that were in the investigations unit at that time.
Okay. Did you have an occasion to actually go in and speak with Ms. Williams?
Yes, I did. Once her interview was completed by the investigator, Mr. McCraney took some time to talk to her. Then I obtained permission to go in and talk to Denise.
Okay. And did you do so?
Yes, sir, I did.
Now, at that point, she's not detained. She's not being arrested or any of that stuff, correct?
No, sir.
Okay. Did you ask her about Brian being involved in Mike Williams' disappearance?
Yes, sir. After talking to Denise for a few minutes, explaining who I was, who I worked for, and our interest in the case, I tried to talk to her about that there may be a connection between what happened that day and the disappearance of Mike. In other words, because of the activity of Brian that day, there may be some culpability there. Well, she did not agree to that. She told me that if she had any indication, any belief that Brian may have done something to her husband at the time, she certainly would not have married him.
Okay. Now, it's my understanding that Mr. Winchester had held a gun to her.
Yes, sir.
Had kidnapped her.
Yes, sir.
Made her drive somewhere.
Yes, sir.
Maybe possibly had some items of bleach in that car and tarps and things along those lines.
That's what I understand, yes, sir.
And when you asked her about his involvement in Mike Williams, she says, certainly not.
Correct.
Never, no.
Yeah, I tried to convince her that everything that was gathered and all the information that was there, that that certainly could have been the last day of her life. I was trying to impress upon her this, but it didn't seem to connect.
At any point did she say, all these years later, I never believed you would have, but given what happened today, maybe it was true?
No, sir.
Nothing along those lines?
No, sir.
Flat out denial?
Denial.
Do you see Ms. Williams here in the courtroom today?
Yes, sir, I do.
Can you please point to her and indicate an article of clothing she's wearing?
Yes, she's sitting over here to my right, blonde hair. She's wearing a pink type of garment with a white underblouse.
May the record please reflect these indicated defendant, Ms. Denise Williams. No further question. Cross.
Agent Devaney, let me start where you left off with the questioning of Denise Williams.
Yes, sir.
There were how many law enforcement officers were there at that time?
In the room with me?
Yes.
None.
Well, beforehand, there were other people questioning her, right?
Yes, sir. There was initially, I believe it was Paul Salvo with the Leon County Sheriff's Office. I think he was in charge of that investigation. After Mr. Salvo, then Mr. McCraney talked to Denise for a few minutes, and after that, I talked to her.
And you confronted her with your suspicion that she was involved in the murder?
Basically, what I asked Denise flat out was about, do you know where Mike is buried? And she says, no, I do not.
And now it's fair to say you were pretty tough on her during that interview, weren't you?
I don't think I was tough on her. Basically, I wouldn't consider this an interview with her. People keep referring to this as an interview. I look at it as a contact. I wanted Denise to know that FDLE was involved in the disappearance of Mike and had been, since the very beginning. No, I don't think I was tough on her at all. I mean, this was not a pre-planned contact. This was certainly spur of the moment. And if anybody views this, they realize I was not rough on her at all.
But you are a trained law enforcement officer, and I assume that you have techniques that you use to get people to admit to crimes. Would that be fair to say?
At times, but there again, this was not a pre-planned contact. If it was, there would have been a lot more preparation with this, a lot more, questions lined up ahead of time, and the circumstances would have been different. This was sort of on the cuff. Again, I just want to let her know that FDLE was involved in this.
But ultimately, she told you she had no knowledge of any of it, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, I'd like to go back to your investigation of this case spanned a pretty long period of time, off and on, I guess, right?
As far as my participation,
Yes.
sir, since 2010.
And I realize there were some things that were done early on that you were basically looking over that you didn't do yourself.
Correct.
So I'd like to go back to, if I understand correctly, the allegation that was made was that Denise Williams helped Brian Winchester plan the murder. She talked to him about it. And what I'd like to ask you is if you're aware of any evidence that she took any action in furtherance of that plan, if she committed any overt act to make that happen.
Any overt act? No, sir.
I'm sorry.
No, sir, I don't.
No. Okay. And let me go ask you now about the crime a little bit more broadly. I don't want to ask you about what people told you. I realize that you talked to lots of people in the course of your investigation.
Sure.
But what you were able to determine, were you able to uncover any physical or tangible evidence that you feel connects Denise Williams to this murder?
No tangible evidence, no, sir.
No. And how long did you work on this?
On and off since 2010.
And you did an immense review. This is Mr. Fuchs's term. You did an immense review.
Correct.
Is that right?
Correct.
And so this immense review did not reveal any tangible or physical evidence to connect this defendant to the crime.
Not until the arrest of Mr. Winchester.
Well, I know what he told you. I'm not talking about what somebody told you.
Sure,
I'm talking
okay.
about physical evidence.
No, sir.
All right. I have just one more area that I want to explore with you, and that is
Yes, sir.
the, and I realize this was before you got involved in it, but the period of 97 to 2000, and there was some discussion, I think, that you had about telephone records. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if you know. Maybe that was maybe that was investigator Sparkman who was saying that. So let me just ask this question: do you know what? And I'm not sure this is a law enforcement term, so tell me if it's not.
Okay.
But what if I use the term credit card surveillance? Would that ring a bell with you and make some sense to you?
Maybe credit card examination, but not
Examination.
surveillance.
What
Yeah.
would that be? What would that entail?
Basically going over credit card records of an individual. That's
And
right.
why would you be doing that in a particular investigation?
Try to get a tracking or a history of expenditures by that individual.
So just to give the jury an example, if I went to Starbucks this morning and bought a cup of coffee at 20 minutes after 9 and I paid for it with a credit card, you could get my credit card record, you could subpoena that and prove that Phil Padavano was at Starbucks at 9:20 in the morning in Tallahassee.
At this day and age, you can do that.
All right. And in the same way, you can construct a whole narrative of where people, assuming they use credit cards, where they go, what they do, and where they go.
At this day and age, you can do that, yes, sir.
Well, let me ask you, you say this day and age. Was there not MasterCard and Visa and American Express in 1997?
Yes, sir, were. Yes, sir.
Did you look and see if Brian Winchester had one of those credit cards?
Maybe some of the people before I had this case may have looked at
Are
it.
you aware of anyone who looked at his credit cards?
Not off the top of my head.
So
no,
if
sir.
he used his credit cards to buy flowers for Denise Williams or something like that, you would have no idea.
Yes, sir.
If he used his credit card to pay for a hotel room, you would have no idea.
I'm not sure the record keeping that would have been, the same back then it is now. I have no idea.
Well, let's go back to that. Are you saying that we didn't have MasterCard and American Express and
We
Visa
did.
cards in
Yes.
1997?
No, we did.
We did.
Yes, sir.
And we had subpoenas in 1997, did we not?
We did.
So if somebody in law enforcement, and please believe me, I'm not trying to criticize your work.
Sure.
I realize this is something that happened after you got in, I mean, before you got involved in the case.
Yes, sir.
But so let me just say, law enforcement generally could have figured out with credit cards, assuming he used a credit card, where he was. If he was courting Denise during that period of time, someone could have maybe found some evidence of that.
If subpoenas would have been issued, there's a chance of that, yes, sir.
Okay. But as there is no evidence of that other than what Brian Winchester says.
Correct.
Thank you.
Redirect.
Yes, Your Honor. Question was asked, if you issued a subpoena in 1997, could you have gotten the credit cards?
Could I have gotten the credit cards?
If you had issued a subpoena in 1997, that was the question that was asked, correct?
Yes, sir.
1997, Mike Williams was still alive, was he not?
He was.
Okay. In 2000, 3 years after 1997, when he was missing, at that point he was a missing person, was he not?
Correct.
And it wasn't until many, many years later when Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the State Attorney's Office reviewed it in 2007, 2008, 2009, 10, that it became a suspicious circumstances that would have necessitated those records, correct?
Correct.
Prior to those dates, those records aren't maintained by the bank groups, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, indefinitely, are they not?
That's correct.
And in fact, there were efforts made by law enforcement to go back and get those records, but they had been purged.
That's what I understand, yes, sir.
Even further along, back in 1997, 2000, what we're talking about, it's a different time period with credit cards and everything like that. People still wrote checks, did they not?
Correct.
Okay. Banking records are obtainable, but again, you have to know to obtain them, correct?
Correct.
Cash can never be tracked.
True.
Last question about no tangible evidence, no overt act was done by Mrs. Williams, Miss Winchester. Fair to say if there had been an overt act or tangible evidence, she probably would have been arrested prior to the time she was, correct?
Correct.
The nature of a conspiracy is to keep those secrets, is it not?
Correct.
And in fact, because they remained a secret for as long as it did until 2016 when Brian Winchester confessed, they were pretty good at keeping that secret, were they not?
Very good.
No further questions.
All right. Any juror have a question of this witness? All right. You can step down. We need to keep him further.
Still be retained, Your Honor, but so that he can go about his business.
Remain on call.
Yes,
Call your next witness.
Your Honor, this time we need to take a manifest evidence.
All right. We need to let the jury step out. Need to have Mr. Winchester brought in. Everybody be seated, please. We need Mr. Winchester. It's Mr. Jensen here. Mr. Bukes.
I'm going to get him, Your Honor.